This is London's Farringdon Station. It truly is a junction in every meaning of the word. Not only is it the place where London's sprawling tube network, the National Rail network and Crossrail all come together in one place, it's also a location within which millions of people's lives intersect every year without any of them ever having realised it. Farringdon is strangely representative of London in so many ways. When you walk up to the station from the street, you are confronted by a smart new public space that is covered in steel and glass. It's flooded with natural light as if it were a huge atrium, the type of which would make even the most pompous Victorian architect proud. But yet, when you go down to the platforms, the reality is quite different. The brickwork is aging, jagged, and covered in layer upon layer of grit, grime, and dirt. The place is filled with shadowy alcoves, bustling winds coming through from north and south, and also a sickening diet of blood-curdling screams. Over the years, there have been no shortages of theories and hypotheses over what could be the cause of such a blood-soaked sound. One of the most popular theories, though, is that the sound is the product of a screaming spectre, a child ghost, no less, who hails from the 1700s. Anne Naylor was just 13 years old in 1758 when she was cruelly murdered by her employer, Sarah Metyard. Anne, along with her 8-year-old sister Mary and 2 other girls, were apprentices to the Metyards in their millinery in Berkeley Square. Anne, unfortunately, had suffered an herpetic infection of her finger, which had led to it being amputated, and this meant that she couldn't sew as well as the other girls. In response to this, the Metyards bullied her even more severely than they did her colleagues. She was fed even less food and beaten even more frequently. This meant that she grew weaker and less able, which in turn resulted in even more beatings and even greater reductions in her food, thus making her weaknesses even more pronounced. Out of sheer desperation, Anne tried to escape on 2 occasions, but never managed to make it past the front door. On the 2nd occasion, she was actually intercepted by Mr. Brown, the milkman, and despite her protestations and pleading for him to let her go, he handed her back to the Metyards. Poor Anne's punishment was swift, and it was ruthless. She was bundled upstairs, marched by the neck into a bedroom, where one of the Metyards held her down whilst the other one went to work with a broom on her body. Once she'd been beaten into submission, she was marched up to the next floor in the building, where she was tied to a door by her waist and left there for 3 days. This was so she couldn't lay down and she couldn't rest. She was allowed just a couple of hours short break each day so she could sleep. And on the last day, she was said to have been so weak that she managed to get to her bedroom on her hands and knees, groaning, moaning, and crying out in sheer agony caused by starvation, brutality, and outright unimaginable cruelty. During the entirety of this ordeal, not once was she even allowed a drop of water. And on the 3rd day, one of the other girls noticed that Anne was bent over double, not moving, and failing to respond. It seemed that her poor, frail, weak body had simply been unable to cope with the pressures and the injuries. And one might surmise that for someone in such a hopeless position, maybe that end was somewhat of a relief. Now, that being said, I'm sure that for most people they would imagine that at least the ordeal was over. But you'd be wrong. The other girls who'd discovered poor Anne raised the alarm because, well, they were frightened and they wanted to help their friend. First, they summoned the Metyards and she came running, and then proceeded to take off her shoe and smack Anne on the bottom and then the hand repeatedly, declaring that she would make the wretched girl move. Clearly that wasn't going to happen, and after a while, she went and got her mum. Now, it's worth remembering at this point that Anne still hadn't been cut down from the door, so she was still bent double, expired. The mother, Sarah Metyard, came running up the stairs, having regarded the scene in front of her, immediately cut the poor girl down. She then sent her daughter to fetch some drops and told the rest of the girls to leave everything to her because poor Anne had obviously had a fit but would be perfectly fine. This was where an already sickening situation started to turn into a really, really dark charade. You see, that time where Anne Naylor was still strung to the door, bent over double, life expired, was the last time that her sister or the other girls ever saw her. So because of the lowly status of the girls, of the apprentices, they would normally do most of their washing, their ablutions, in an area of the house known as the garret. Now this would be up in the attic, far away from the stairs, far away from the amenities. It was kind of where those that were born into service, those that were the hired help, were stuffed away out of sight to do those ungodly and smelly things that they have to do. That was part of the girls' routines. But strangely, in the days following poor Anne's demise, the Met Yards started instructing the girls not to wash in the garret as they normally would, but instead to use the family bathroom. The door to the garret was kept securely locked and was under constant supervision of the Met Yard family. Obviously, the girls found this really strange because the honour, if you will, of using a normal bathroom was something that was far beyond the social reach, even of the most clamouring working poor. So to be moved from the undesirable garret down to the family bathroom started to ring alarm bells in the minds of these young girls. Now, the Met Yards simply told the girls that Anne was extremely sick and she was not to be disturbed. They even made a show of cooking her meals and taking them to the garret door. The place would then return empty in order to give the illusion that Anne was simply resting. Now, the mother, Sarah Met Yard, was well aware of the fact that this could not go on forever. So she came up with a cunning ruse. A couple of days later, during dinner, she pretended that she'd heard a noise, something unexplained coming from upstairs in the house, and she went to investigate, only to come down horrified, where she breathlessly announced, not only to the girls but also to her own family, that Anne must have escaped. The garret door was unlocked, the front door was open. Clearly the poor wretched working girl had made a final, successful grab for freedom. Now, if you think about it, this plan kind of makes sense. You know, she's an invisible member of the underclass. No one cares what happens to her, but they do know that she's got a history of trying to run away. Very reliable, upstanding members of the community could attest to that. Everyone from the Met Yard's neighbours right down to Mr. Brown, the milkman. So they thought that they'd found the perfect fire exit, but those apprentice girls were not convinced. They did not buy this whole smokescreen. And their disbelief hinged on two things. Firstly, unlike the Met Yards, they knew and cared about Anne Naylor. And secondly, well, if she had run away, she'd left without her shoes. Whilst the Met Yards were pretending that everything was just fine, the alarm bells were ringing louder and louder, to the point where they were so loud surely someone, anyone, would hear the chime of the bells. Join me in part 2 to find out how this whole sorry Victorian house of cards came tumbling down. London's Farringdon Station has, since it was built, played host to clashes between oblivious parallel existences and colliding commutes between Victorian iron and modernistic steel and glass, and also to a child ghost from the 1700s who's said to haunt those who wait for the last train. Anne Naylor was just 13 years old when she met a gruesome end at the hands of her employer, Milner Sarah Met Yard. Punishment for the crime of trying to escape was meted out upon Anne Naylor ruthlessly and endlessly over a period of 3 days by Sarah Met Yard and her daughter. In the days that followed, the remains of Anne were left in the garret. They were then moved on the second day to another room in the house, and then on the fourth day they were taken out and simply dumped in a box, where they remained for 2 months. Let's not be bashful about this. After 2 months, nature would be taking its course and things would be starting to smell. The Met Yard knew that it would only be a matter of time before the smell started to draw attention, so they had to take action. They did what any other sane family that had just brought an end to the life of another do, and they held a family conference. The product of their deliberations was that they should solve the problem through the medium of fire. However, quickly thereafter they realised that this wouldn't work, mainly because the smell of burning evidence would draw just as much attention to them as the smell of leaving the evidence to nature's course. Also, it would take too long. And as a third reason, the fire probably would never burn hot enough to do what they needed it to do. No, instead, they decided that the most effective way of dealing with it was to separate the evidence into two bags. The plan was very simple. The head unit and the main area would be placed into one bag. Meanwhile, the extremities would be placed into a second bag. It was only at that point that they remembered that Anne had an identifying feature. During childhood, she'd suffered an herpetic infection in her hand, which had led to the amputation of one of her fingers. If any other lines of sight may fall on the evidence that remained, maybe that could lead authorities back to a swift and easy identification, and that was something they could ill afford. That said, these parts of the evidence were removed in a fire. Being a proud lady who got things done, Sarah Met Yard wasted no time in transporting the evidence to Chick Lane, which was the site of a sewer 1.5 miles away. And when you think about it, it kind of makes sense. You might as well leave something that smells not too great in an area that generally won't be smelling like a meadow full of lavender. But when Sarah got to Chick Lane, well, the sewer was overflowing, it was clogged up. So she ended up leaving the evidence in the gully hole in the entrance to the sewer, went to a local pub to have a drink to calm her nerves. Now, she knew the landlord really rather well, and when she went in, he instantly remarked on the stench that seemed to hang around her. He asked her what she was using to perfume herself these days, but she didn't take the joke kindly. Instead, she snapped at him that she didn't know what he was talking about. She quickly drank her drink, and she made her way home to the sanctity of Berkeley Square. Sarah Met Yard had not long since made it home when the evidence she'd deposited at Chick Lane sewer was found by a constable and 2 watchmen who were making their midnight rounds. What had drawn them to the evidence? Well, it was the smell that she denied all knowledge of. They made a thorough search of the area and found all parts of the evidence, despite the hands. Thomas Lovegrove was a very important man in the local community. He was the overseer of the parish of St Andrew in Holborn. And despite it being nearly midnight, the constable summoned him to the scene, and he quickly attended. When he got there, he immediately issued instructions for the constable and the watchman to go collect all the pieces of evidence that had been found, take them back to the workhouse, and prepare them for the visit the next day of the coroner, the fantastically named Mr. Umfreville. Now, you might think this is the part of the story where the long arm of the law finally grasps the grubby collar of Sarah Met Yard and holds her to account. But you'd be wrong. Looking at this through the prism of modern forensic science, it would be astounding to think that evidence of this nature might be discovered, taken to a place for coronial inspection, but washed in preparation beforehand. Think of all those forensic clues, think of all those investigative gold nuggets that might have led the police towards final justice for Anne Naylor. Alas, in 1758, this wasn't the way that things were done. Mr. Umfreville arrived, checked the body, which had been carefully washed by the constable, concluded that this was obviously a cadaver that had been practiced on by surgeons. With that in mind, he simply refused to appoint a jury to investigate the death any further, and as a result, Anne Naylor's final remains were swiftly sent for burial. In true Scooby-Doo style, the Met Yards might have got away with it if it wasn't for those meddling kids, or at least an impending sense of guilt. You see, Sarah Met Yard couldn't live with the overwhelming guilt that came with what she'd done, and her mental health declined rapidly over the following 2 years. She became more and more paranoid. She wouldn't let her daughter leave the house, and when it came to the thought of her getting a job, she certainly wouldn't let that happen because she was terrified that the secret might slip out. This was allowed to continue until a man by the name of Mr. Rooker took pity on Sarah Metyard's daughter and offered her a job as a servant to his family. Sarah Metyard couldn't handle this. She developed a pattern of behaviour where she would regularly visit the Rookers' family home and throw horrible insults at her daughter, repeatedly accusing her of selling her modesty to Mr. Rooker for money. The Rookers left London not long after, but Sarah Metyard followed them and ended up getting into a fight with her own daughter at knife point that was broken up by Mr. Rooker. As he held the two women apart, they traded insults, while Sarah Metyard's daughter making the cryptic yet hard-hitting insult that her mom was the Chick Lane ghost. This insult played on Mr. Rooker's mind and he couldn't let it go. Eventually, he forced Sarah Metyard's daughter to spill the beans. He eventually persuaded her to go to the authorities. He sent a letter to the parish at Tottenham High Cross. Unfortunately for Sarah Metyard's daughter, Sarah Metyard was one step ahead, and she'd already exacted her revenge by reporting her daughter to the authorities for the murder. Both women stood trial on the 14th of July 1762 at London's Old Bailey. Such was the mutual hatred between mother and daughter that they had to be housed in separate parts of the prison, and predictably, they blamed each other. Despite the chicanery and toing and froing, it didn't take long for the jury to see through the lies, and they swiftly convicted both women for the unaliving of Anne Naylor. As was customary at the time, they were sentenced to be expired by means of the noose. Following the sentence, Sarah Metyard's daughter made a plea for her belly. The records are fantastic in their phrasing. They said that a panel of matrons was swiftly convened to prove that this was nothing more than a false claim, and the sentence was upheld. This wasn't only justice for Anne, this was justice for her younger sister Mary, who'd also gone missing shortly after the original deed. It turned out that she was freely sharing with people what she saw had happened with her sister, and this had meant an inevitable end for her as well. Despite there being no evidence, they were also found guilty of unaliving the younger sister. And on the 19th of July, both ladies met the carrying out of their sentence. Anne Naylor was at rest until Farringdon Station was built with the construction of the railway, something that necessitated her exhumation, and she's been restless as a spirit apparently ever since. Do you think that this really is the Screaming Spectre of Farringdon? Have you ever heard the ghostly sounds? Let me know in the comments, and stay safe.